Okay, so let's get into AWS Elastic Beanstalk. Beanstalk is going to be more on the developer exam, but from a solutions architect professional exam, you need to understand that it is a great platform to re-platform your application from on-premise to the AWS cloud. So the idea is that it's a developer-centric view of deploying an application on AWS, and it's just a wrapper around all the components that we know from before. So EC2 instances, auto-scaling groups, Elastic IP, Elastic Load Balancers, RDS, etc. But it's in one view, and it's easy to make sense of it. So we still have control over all the configuration of each component, but Beanstalk gives us some flexibility for deployment. Beanstalk is going to be free, but you're going to pay for the underlying instances. Okay, so Beanstalk has support for many platforms, and you have to remember some of them. Go, Java with Tomcat, and that is very important because if you have a Tomcat application on-premise and you want to migrate it to the cloud, Java with Tomcat is a great option on Beanstalk. .NET applications for Windows Server, Node.js, PHP, Python, Ruby, Packer. So as you can see, there's a bunch of support for many different runtimes. And if you don't have a runtime that is supported by Beanstalk, it is possible for you to use a single Docker container or a multi-container Docker or a pre-configured Docker. The idea is that if you can Dockerize your application, then you can migrate it to Elastic Beanstalk. And if it's not supported, you can write your own custom platform, which is advanced. And so the idea is that Beanstalk is going to be a perfect solution to re-platform your application from on-premise to the cloud. That means moving your runtime onto Beanstalk and have your application run as a native AWS application without changing the code too much. Okay, so Beanstalk is a managed service. That means that all the instance configuration and the OS configuration will be handled by Beanstalk. The deployment strategy is configurable, but it will be performed by Beanstalk as well, so you have different rollout strategies. The only thing in the responsibility of you is the application code. And so you have three architecture models on Beanstalk we can see. The number one is a single instance deployment, which is great for dev. Load balancer plus ASG, which is good for production or pre-production web applications. And finally, just an auto-scaling group, which is good if you have a non-web application in production, and this is usually called a worker environment. So let's have a look at how it looks like in terms of diagram. So the first thing we have is going to be a single instance, and the architecture chosen by Beanstalk in this example is obviously only one availability zone. We have an EC2 instance in it, and we'll have an Elastic IP attached to our EC2 instance. Why? Because in case the EC2 instance is replaced for whatever update, then the Elastic IP can be moved over to the new EC2 instance, and from a client perspective, the change in the upgrade is going to be seamless. Finally, you can set up an Amazon RDS database through Beanstalk for having your EC2 instance communicate with a database layer if it needs to. And that RDS instance is going to be obviously set up in only one AZ. So these single instance deployments are great for development environments because you can quickly show your application and it's going to be very cost effective. If you want high availability, a more production-like setup, then you need to use a load balancer, for example an ALB, and then your application is going to be multi-AZ. So in this example, I've only represented 2 AZ, but it can obviously be 3. So you have 2 AZ, an auto-scaling group of EC2 instances that can scale over time to handle more or less traffic. And then we can even set up an RDS database again in terms of storing our backend data. But this time, because this is more a production deployment, we should use a multi-AZ deployment of RDS where we have a master and a standby database. That is for number 2. And then number 3 is a worker tier, which is very important. So in this example, we have an SQS queue that is managed by Beanstalk, and we have a worker tier which consists of an EC2 auto-scaling group that will read from the SQS queue and scale based on the queue load. So the idea is that we have 3 different kinds of deployment for Beanstalk, and you need to know them going into the exam. Now let's talk about the difference between a web server and a worker environment in Beanstalk. So in case your application performs a long task, and this task can take a lot of CPU power and threads from your web servers, it's usually better to upload these tasks into a dedicated worker environment. And by doing this, you are decoupling your application into 2 tiers, and that is very common. And so anytime we hear decoupling, remember, it has to be SQS. So for example, what are the kind of tasks that could be long to complete? Well, processing a video if you want to add some kind of text on top of the video, or generating a zip file, or creating a very complicated filter for your images, etc. On top of it, In your worker environment, you are able to define a bunch of periodic tasks to be done using a cron.yaml file, which will run cron jobs directly from your worker environment. Okay, so let's have a look at a typical architecture for Beanstalk. You would have your web tier for Beanstalk, which consists of your ALB and your autoscaling group, and that is going to be a production-like deployment. And then we're going to have a worker tier also managed by Beanstalk, which consists of an SQSQ and an EC2 instances managed by an autoscaling group. And the idea is that if the web tier has some dedicated tasks that are going to be long to complete, then it would put these tasks into as SQSQ, and your autoscaling group would automatically process these tasks. This is a classic architecture, and the good thing is that both of these tiers can be managed using Beanstalk. Okay, next we have blue-green deployment, which is not a direct feature of Beanstalk, but the idea is that it gives you zero downtime and release facility. So the idea is that you would create a new stage environment and you would deploy a V2 there, so you would create a new Beanstalk environment. Then you validate that this environment, which is the green environment, can be working as expected, and in case there's any problem, you can roll it back and by deleting it. And then you would set up Route 53 to use weighted routing to make sure you can shift a little bit of traffic to the new environment. If you use the Beanstalk swap URL feature, which is a DNS swap, this basically shifts all the traffic from one environment to another. So you have two different strategies. So here's the example using weighted routing in Route 53. So the web traffic does DNS queries onto Route 53, and then maybe 90% of your traffic will be sent into your blue environment, and 10% of your traffic will be sent into your green environment. And that is using a weighted routing policy in Route 53. And then you can shift the percentages over time. And then when you're ready, you have effectively shifted all your traffic from your V1 to your V2. And this is called a blue-green deployment. Okay, so that's all you need to know for Beanstalk going into the exam. Remember, Beanstalk is going to be a great platform when you want to migrate an application from on-premise to the cloud and re-platform it. And finally, it's going to be a great choice to manage both your web server applications and your worker tiers. Okay, I will see you in the next lecture.